I lived in Salford for a while, and I've seen, I had a really positive time in living up there. And I see the optimism and the growth for Greater Manchester as an area with this massive mayoral devolution that allows you to be more collaborative and have this longer term planning. I don't see that same support for places like my constituency in Mansfield in Nottinghamshire, which is exactly that town you talked about that likes to talk about our proud history of things that happened 30 years ago, that doesn't attract people to want to stay there and work there. So what is the best way of achieving that kind of place-based focus? You talk about opportunity areas a lot. Mansfield, even though it's higher on the charts than most of the opportunity areas that do exist, hasn't got one, so we miss out on that. How should we be mapping that? How should we be structuring it? Should we have that kind of, devolved authority everywhere? The East Midlands, again, as an example, the Midlands engine focused very much on Birmingham and then devolved authority. In the East Midlands, you've got 27 different councils that can't work together and can't pull those priorities together. So what's that structure need to look like if we're going to be able to deliver that everywhere?
I'm sure Henri's got...
I was going to say, so I think in education terms specifically, you can make a strong argument that when we talk about cities, what we're really talking about city regions, so the kind of Longley Farm answer, which is similar to this one, is that in reality, the universities in that part of the world need to retain more of their graduates, and you need to then do more on adult skills, and that has to be done at a wider level than just the individual town. And that is the challenge, which is that the functional economic geography of our towns and cities doesn't work in the north and many parts of the Midlands. It's exactly the same problem, which is that people are often too disconnected from the major cities to really benefit from them. And then, even when they are connected, that we haven't necessarily got the skills in the education system right, so that people who come from these places that theoretically could get a job somewhere actually can get a job there. And that actually applies in, say, Hilary Benn's constituency, which is literally a few hundred metres from the city centre of Leeds, as much as it does in a town. Because what we're really talking about is, can people from different backgrounds access the great opportunities that exist? And can they do so while staying part of their community in the broader sense, if they want to, or choosing to move around if that's what they want, but not having a presumption they have to do that to access opportunity. And I think the government has really lost momentum on devolution, and now is saying till after Brexit we might do something, but not very much. And I think that there is a huge, which is a separate issue for another part of the policy agenda, but education was never central enough to devolution in the first place, and we haven't seen anywhere near enough progress on more city regions getting devolution. Those two things would be much more sustainable solutions rather than more area-based programmes that aren't underpinned by any democratic legitimacy or oversight. Because, as I was saying earlier, if you can do things for a long term, then they will subsist and they will keep coming. If you do things as an initiative, they will always eventually die out.
Two quick comments. First one is to highlight something I just wrote about the FT myself at Stockport, very close to where I'm from, which I watched, sadly, for years. And out of the blue, it looks to me, and it does link partly to what GM has had devolved, because it gives the mayor some powers. Stockport's own leaders are creating a very credible, exciting plan for doing something to change the buzz about Stockport. The second thing is, it's easier for them because they've got the help of the devolved capability. When you get to more isolated towns, it's trickier. It is definitely trickier, but we need things like the concept of a place-based fund to become more central to how country policymakers think. And I have to say in that regard, linked to the broader issues of Trumpism and Brexit, in the world where I originate from, a sort of, if one could describe economists as big thinkers, which one probably shouldn't, it's interesting that some prominent people around the world, the ex-Indian central bank governor Rajan, who is touted as one of the possible new candidates here, rightly or wrongly, is talking a lot about communities, for example, out of the blue. Paul Collier, famous economist in development economics, is extremely now passionate about the north of England. And so I think the environment for really homing in on these things is getting better.
Well, that's good. I certainly agree that the collaborative element on a local level in that decision making is vital to it. It's a bit that we struggle with locally. I wanted to just ask you, still on kind of opportunity areas really. I mean, you mentioned last time the need for this genuine kind of 0 to 25 approach, and it was you, Henri, that said that. and taking it back to, for these kids, if you want to achieve outcomes for young people, you've got to take it back to when they were born and start there. It touches again on what's been said about the broader services and children's services as well. Have you figured out how to do that? Because we're talking a lot about your interventions. Lucy's just been showing me through your report that focuses on the secondary schools, and again, some that seem to crop up that look like they're in my neck of the woods as well. It's really interesting. I know it would be a hugely welcome intervention, but still focuses on secondary education specifically, when a lot of the data suggests that by the time kids get to 5 or 6, they're kind of set in a pattern in a lot of issues. So how do you do that? If you've got very focused, obviously limited cash, you've got focused interventions, and you're calling for interventions in secondary, how do you take that back to the start?
So, very, very quickly, Henri. So the answer is, Lucy knows, early years, and the other parallel part of my hat here is with Shine, the educational VC, we moved north, getting on now for 2 years ago, and one of the big things we are really focused on and have committed some of our capital is on early years, because of all the reasons you say. It's quite clear to me from the 20-odd years I've been thinking about all this stuff, with the very odd exception of the North East, if you don't put a lot of initiative in the early years, the other stuff all gets progressively more difficult.
So in terms of the detail of our proposals, we would say you need a third split. So you spend a third at secondary, a third at primary, and a third at a sure start point, whatever you want to do in that space. And that's very similar to what the Children's Commissioner said. She also looked at area-based budgets around the early years. And I think the very specific point about how you make sure you spend that money effectively is that at the moment, what we're not doing is thinking about where the key issues are in the system. And the evidence says that if we can't close the disadvantage gap by 11, it just gets wider. So the challenge is, can you get to 5 and close the disadvantage gap? Can you even start to exceed, so that at primary schools, some of our most challenging areas, they're getting better outcomes than the national average with many of those kids? And can you almost have 0 to sort of almost positive gaps? So can you sometimes get to the point where your disadvantaged kids at 11 are doing better than the average in that school, which is where you would really aspire to get to, right? And that will then mean that secondary education, you have a fighting chance of turning it around. But if you continue to allow the disadvantage gap to grow pre-11 and pre-5, which is what's currently happening relative to London, so London's making huge strides still in those areas, and they are partly driven by demographics, but they're not entirely demographic-led. We need to catch up. And I think if the government took a systematic view, you could see very clearly how that would get you to the point of genuinely closing the disadvantage gap, entering into the world of work. Because what you really want is people to be work ready. And we've talked very much about measuring income, say, at 25, because that's a better way in the longer term to measure schools. Now, we can't do that now, because it would take quite a long time to start doing that. But we should start feeding that into schools so they understand how their kids have done 10 years after they've left. Because hopefully they will then focus on some of the challenges and opportunities for those young people, because even those that maybe don't attain academically could still have more of those work-ready skills, like the UTC movement and others prioritise, and that could be mainstreamed across the wider education system.